In the pitch-black heart of Nazi-occupied Paris, when the world felt broken and escape was, well, just a desperate dream, a trusted doctor offered a lifeline. He promised freedom, safe passage to a better place. But what if that promise was a lie? What if that doctor was actually a predator, his sanctuary, a meticulously planned slaughterhouse?
That stark contrast, between the trusted healer and the cold-blooded killer, that's really where the sources we're diving into today begin. We're exploring the horrifying case of Dr. Marcel Petiot,
Right.
and we're drawing on historical accounts, criminological studies, reports from the time, quite a bit of material.
And our mission in this deep dive, using all this material, is to really try and get inside the story and, crucially, understand the psychology the sources describe. Like, how did he weave such a complex web of deception?
How did that work?
What was the role of just extreme greed? It seems overwhelming. How did the unique chaos, the desperation of wartime Paris, become his hunting ground?
And that medical authority.
Exactly. How is his authority as a physician basically a weapon? And maybe the most compelling question, do the sources suggest he was purely a cynical opportunist, or was there something deeper, like a fundamental psychopathy at play? Especially when you look at that bizarre patriot defense he used later.
It's definitely an unsettling journey looking into this particular dark corner of human behavior. It reveals so much about how extreme circumstances can be exploited by, well, a certain kind of mind.
So let's set the scene first, like the sources do. You have to imagine Paris, early 1940s. It's under the Nazi boot.
Yeah.
This is a pervasive atmosphere of fear, uncertainty. And for so many people, Jews, members of the resistance, anyone marked for persecution, just a desperate need to disappear.
It's an environment where trust is incredibly fragile, but the need for help is just immense. And into this really vulnerable landscape steps Dr. Marcel Petiot. And the sources describe how he didn't even use his own name with these potential victims. He presented himself as Dr. Eugene, someone running this highly secret, supposedly absolutely reliable escape network.
He spun this whole story, didn't he? Guaranteed passage out of France, places like Argentina, other South American countries.
Yeah.
Anywhere far from the occupation.
Right, a ticket to safety.
And for this promised salvation, he demanded everything. The sources really consistently highlight these exorbitant fees people would hand over their entire life savings, jewelry, valuables.
Everything they had left.
Yeah, truly seeing him as their absolute best hope.
And what's so chilling about the deception mechanism, as the sources lay it out, is how simple it was, but also how incredibly cruel. It preyed entirely on that desperation. Victims were directed to his townhouse, quite an elegant place, actually, at 21 Rue Le Sueur, a respectable neighborhood.
A seemingly normal address that became, well, infamous as the House of Horrors. And they were often told to come there under the pretense of getting necessary medical shots, right? Or documents for their journey.
Yes, exactly. Using his medical identity to lend legitimacy right up to the very end. The sources detail the methods used inside, lethal injections. Very likely using poisons like cyanide, administered under the guise of, a necessary inoculation for their travels. There's also mention in some accounts of a soundproofed room, possibly adapted as a kind of gas chamber, although the specifics of how it worked are, well, they're debated in the material we looked at.
And once the victims were dead, the horror continued with the disposal. But critically, after he'd gone through their things, the sources are really clear. His first step was plundering their belongings.
Absolutely. That initial act just speaks volumes about his motive. The sources describe these gruesome methods of disposing of the bodies to destroy evidence dismemberment, burning them in a large coal stove in the basement, or dissolving them in pits of quicklime. It was systematic, almost an industrial-scale process of erasure, but only after extracting every last valuable.
Knowing how systematic it all was, you have to wonder, was this evil born just from the war, from the opportunity? Or were there hints much earlier? Do the sources shed any light on his background?
They definitely suggest there were unsettling signs long before the war provided this particular stage. The sources describe a deeply troubled youth, delinquency, getting expelled from schools, even a diagnosis of psychological issues after his service in World War I. And then, even in his early career as a doctor, and later when he was actually mayor in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne.
He was the mayor.
He was. And there were persistent rumors, even documented instances of suspicious activity, allegations of theft, fraud involving state medical funds, illegal abortions, unexplained deaths connected to him, and a clear pattern of abusing any position of power he held.
So it wasn't a sudden descent then?
No, the sources really point to a disturbing trajectory. It wasn't like the war turned a normal person into a monster.
It sounds more like it gave a pre-existing predatory personality an unparalleled opportunity.
That's precisely how the sources seem to frame it. They describe the Nazi occupation as a kind of grim opportunity for someone like Petiot. The chaos, the complete breakdown of normal societal order, and this huge pool of terrified, vulnerable people desperate enough to trust anyone promising escape, it just created the perfect conditions for his particular brand of predation to flourish, undetected on a massive scale.
And this went on for quite some time, only coming to light in March of 1944. What finally brought the authorities knocking on the door at Rue-le-Sur?
It was the neighbors. They started complaining to the police about this persistent foul stench coming from the townhouse.
Ugh, I can only imagine.
And thick, noxious smoke pouring from the chimney at odd hours. When firefighters arrived to investigate the smoke, they had to force entry, and that's when they discovered the horrifying truth.
What did they find?
In the basement, the coal stove was burning fiercely, emitting this terrible smell because it was fueled by human remains. They found pits containing quicklime and body parts, and throughout the house, suitcases just filled with the victims' clothes and personal effects.
And here's where his incredible audacity comes in, again, as the reports describe it. Petiot actually showed up while the police were on the scene, didn't he?
He did. It's astounding. And his immediate reaction was this calculated bluff. He coolly claimed the bodies were Germans and collaborators he'd killed as a secret resistance fighter.
Unbelievable. Just unbelievable nerve. And he didn't just get arrested right then and there.
No, somehow he managed to slip away during all the confusion before he could be fully questioned or detained. The sources track his movements. He went into hiding.
Okay.
And then, astonishingly, he even managed to join the actual French forces of the interior, the resistance, using a false name, Captain Valery.
He joined the resistance.
Yeah, and apparently earned commendations for his bravery during the liberation of Paris, all while the police were hunting for him as a mass murderer. It just highlights his extreme cunning, his ability to maintain a completely false identity, even under the most intense pressure.
But that couldn't last forever. He was finally arrested when October 1944.
That's right, October 44. And his trial in 1946 was, as you can imagine, a massive national sensation. And central to his defense was that same audacious lie. The patriot defense. He insisted, absolutely insisted, that his victims were enemies of France, Gestapo agents, traitors, collaborators, and that he was a hero who had eliminated them for the resistance.
It just sounds like such a calculated, cynical attempt to play on the post-liberation mood and save his own skin.
That's exactly how the sources interpret it. The prosecution very methodically dismantled this defense piece by piece. They presented evidence that his victims were overwhelmingly Jewish families trying to flee persecution, or just ordinary French citizens, foreigners caught up in the chaos, all people who had paid him their fortunes.
Right.
His patriot claim, according to the sources, was just another layer, another manipulative lie on top of all the others.
So if the patriotism was a complete fabrication, what does the evidence, what do the sources really say was the real driving force behind all this?
Based on the sheer volume of stolen property found and the incredibly systematic nature of the crimes, which were always focused on extracting valuables first. The overwhelming motive presented in the sources is just extreme, insatiable greed.
Purely financial.
Yeah. This wasn't ideological, it wasn't political, it was financially driven. Coupled, of course, with this cold, calculating, and utterly remorseless personality, his trial defense was just a final, desperate, and incredibly cynical attempt to manipulate the narrative one last time.
Okay, let's really zero in now on what the criminological and psychological sources specifically reveal about the mind capable of these acts. How do they actually characterize Petiot?
Well, the sources point very strongly towards a diagnosis of core psychopathy. They list all the kind of hallmark traits he exhibited. A superficial charm, which obviously allowed him to lure victims and maintain his facade.
Essential for the con.
Absolutely. Glibness, a high degree of manipulativeness evident throughout his life, but particularly in that elaborate escape network scam.
He really mastered that mask of sanity you hear about in these cases, didn't he?
Right. Completely.
Right.
The sources also note a grandiose sense of self-worth. You see it in his arrogance at the trial and his chilling boasting about killing 63 people, even though the actual number of victims discovered was lower.
Mm-hmm.
And pathological lying was just fundamental to his existence. The entire Dr. Eugene persona, the fake network, his trial defense, it was all built on layer upon layer of lies.
And absolutely no sign of empathy.
Mm.
or guilt?
None whatsoever, according to the sources.
Oh.
They really emphasize his complete lack of remorse or guilt about the immense suffering he inflicted. He saw people purely as objects, as resources to be exploited. It fits perfectly with the description of a parasitic lifestyle where he lived entirely off the assets he stole from his victims.
Narcissistic traits are also mentioned sometimes, often alongside psychopathy.
Yes, definitely overlapping traits. The sources note his sense of entitlement, this view of others solely as means to his ends, and the profound arrogance he displayed, especially during his trial. He seemed genuinely convinced he was smarter than everyone else in the room.
And it's important, isn't it, to distinguish this from sort of impulsive violence?
Crucially important. The sources highlight his calculated predation. His crimes were highly organized, methodical setting up the network, the dedicated location, the systematic methods of killing and disposal. His violence wasn't random, it wasn't born of passion or rage, it was purely instrumental, it was a tool.
A tool used to get money and eliminate witnesses.
Exactly.
And his profession, being a doctor, was central to this whole elaborate toolkit.
Oh, absolutely vital. His status as a doctor instantly granted him this level of trust, legitimacy, authority that was essential for luring victims. People are just conditioned to trust physicians, especially in times of crisis, and he ruthlessly exploited that trust.
And he used his medical knowledge directly for the killings.
Directly, both the knowledge and the access to substances.
So the war didn't create his psychopathy, but it perfectly enabled it. It gave it the perfect environment.
That's the strong consensus from the sources, yes. They underscore his cynical opportunism. He masterfully recognized and exploited the unique environment of fear, chaos, and extreme desperation in wartime Paris. The societal breakdown provided both the vulnerable population and the cover he needed to operate on such a scale.
And even when faced with execution, he remained defiant. No break in the facade.
Not according to the sources. They note his continued adherence to his false narrative, that patriot story, and a complete lack of remorse right up to the very end. It just reinforces the depth of his psychopathy. There's also a brief speculative mention in some sources about the possibility of sadistic pleasure, derived from controlling terrified victims. But the material generally places the primary drivers firmly on greed and the core psychopathic structure of his personality. Sadism might have been there, but it wasn't the main engine, it seems.
So, pulling together the psychological portrait from these sources,
Yeah.
what's the final picture?
Well, the sources paint a pretty consistent picture of a highly intelligent, exceptionally organized psychopath, someone utterly devoid of conscience, empathy, or remorse. He was driven almost exclusively, it appears, by insatiable greed and was a master manipulator who used every tool at his disposal, most notably his professional status and the unique cover provided by wartime chaos to prey on the most vulnerable people imaginable.
The war was the stage.
Exactly. The war was the stage upon which his pre-existing, deeply predatory nature could finally operate completely unchecked.
This deep dive into the sources really just lays bare a chilling blend of psychopathy, calculated deception, overwhelming greed, all hidden behind this mask of respectability and then wrapped in a false flag of patriotism at the end.
It's a truly stark case study, isn't it? It shows how vulnerability, desperation, and societal breakdown can create this perfect storm for a particular kind of manipulative mind to operate with just horrific effect.
It really leaves you contemplating the frightening effectiveness of deception when it's wielded by someone completely lacking a conscience, particularly when circumstances strip away the usual safeguards and appearances can be so tragically deceiving.